In this video, we're going to continue our conversation of metabolism, specifically looking at catabolism. Recall that catabolism is going to be the breakdown of large molecules, which are going to be lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins, into smaller ones, and eventually break those down to produce ATP. The reason we're interested in producing ATP is because this is going to be what we call our energy-carrying molecule, meaning that it's going to be this molecule that will go on to participate in other chemical reactions in order to help them proceed. Those chemical reactions are the reactions required for movement of your body. So for example, during exercise, for breathing, and so on. So what we're going to do in this video is we're first going to look at the structure of ATP, and then we're going to look at what is called coupled reactions, meaning reactions that are coupled to ATP, in order to understand how it is that this ATP molecule is providing energy to sustain our bodies. So first, let's look at the structure. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The important part is this tri component, the T of ATP. So this triphosphate means that we have three, that's the word tri, phosphate groups. So we have one phosphate group here, second phosphate group, and then the third phosphate group. These phosphate groups are attached to a ribose sugar. They're attached at this 5 carbon. And then there's also an adenosine attached to that ribose, which is going to be the same adenosine that we have in DNA and RNA. Right, so the important part for us here is going to be these phosphate groups here. Why is that? Well, because these are the groups that are going to be cleaved in chemical reactions to provide energy. So let's look at that reaction. Here, I am showing you the hydrolysis of ATP. What we mean by this is that this bond here between this phosphorus atom and this oxygen, shown in red, this bond here is broken during ATP hydrolysis in order to generate an inorganic phosphate group, which is shown here in green. Oftentimes, this will be written shorthand as P sub I, which stands for inorganic phosphate. And then in the process, we are also going to produce ADP. D stands for diphosphate, meaning we now have two phosphate groups on our molecule. Okay, so when we cleave one phosphate group off, we end up with two phosphate groups on our molecule, which is now called ADP, and a release of inorganic phosphate. The important part about this hydrolysis reaction is that when we break this bond, this is called a high energy bond. So what that means is that when we break that bond, we actually release energy. And this has been calculated to be 7.3 kilocalories per mole. So in this reaction, as we cleave this bond and go from ATP to ADP, we release 7.3 kilocalories per mole of energy. We refer to this as the energy change of this reaction. And how we write this is we write it with a negative sign in order to communicate that in this reaction, we are releasing the energy rather than absorbing it. Okay, so a reaction can either release energy or it must absorb energy in order for it to happen. So in this case, this reaction, when that bond is cleaved, it actually releases negative 7.3, or it releases 7.3 kilocalories per mole of energy. So let's look at the reverse process. So what if I am starting with ADP and I want to synthesize ATP, meaning I want to go in the reverse direction? Well, this is called ATP synthesis. And because now I'm going in the reverse direction, now I'm going to require energy. Okay, so now I have ADP. I want to form this bond here to go to ATP. So because I'm going in the reverse direction, now the reaction requires energy. And we write this with a positive sign. So when we have a positive sign in our energy change, that means that reaction requires energy to be provided in order to make the products, in this case, in order to make ATP. But if the sign is a negative, that means that when that reaction proceeds, it's going to release that amount of energy, as I showed you with ATP hydrolysis. So in summary, when you have ATP hydrolysis, this is the reaction that takes place, ATP plus water, because it's hydrolysis, that will convert it to ADP. So now you have two phosphate groups and then one inorganic phosphate group. And that reaction is going to release energy. That's why it has a negative sign in front. If we look at the reverse direction, which is ADP bonding to an inorganic phosphate to create ATP, that is going to require energy. And we write that with a positive sign. So another term I want to introduce here is the term favorable and unfavorable. So when a reaction has a negative energy change, meaning that it releases energy, we call that a favorable reaction. So you will hear these terms used often. When a reaction requires energy, it cannot make this ATP until that energy is provided. So that means that this is an unfavorable reaction because it must wait to have this amount of energy in order to make product. So favorable is when it's negative, unfavorable is when the energy change is positive. All right, so now let's talk about coupled reactions. Why are we looking at whether energy is released or energy is required? Well, in order for a reaction to proceed, the energy change has to be a net negative. And this is where coupling is going to come in. So first, let's define coupled reactions. Coupled reactions are pairs of reactions that occur together, meaning that the energy released by one reaction can be absorbed by the other reaction. So what this means is that if I have an unfavorable reaction, meaning a reaction that has a positive sign, meaning it requires energy, if I couple that to another reaction that provides more than the energy that is needed, then I will have a net favorable reaction. So let's look at those details. So here I have glucose, and I want to add a phosphate group to it in order to make it a glucose 6-phosphate. This is just telling you that the phosphate group was added to carbon number 6 of glucose. Okay, so I want to add a phosphate group to glucose. This is called I want to phosphorylate glucose. Well, this phosphorylation reaction, here the positive energy change is telling me that I need to get 3.3 kilocalories per mole of energy from somewhere. Well, I can provide that energy by coupling it to the hydrolysis of ATP. Just like as we talked about, when I hydrolyze ATP, meaning I convert it from ATP to ADP, releasing this phosphate group, when I hydrolyze ATP, I release negative 7.3 kilocalories, or I release 7.3 kilocalories per mole, which is why it has a negative sign. It means I'm releasing it. So what this means is that when I sum together negative 7.3 plus 3.3, that gives me a total of negative 4.0. So what this means is that my net reaction is going to be overall favorable. So let's look at how we write this net reaction. So you'll notice here this coupled reaction, which is also a net reaction. How we write that is we cancel out the reactants and products that are the same, just like we would in a mathematical equation. So HPO4 appears in the reactants and the products, so those will cancel. H2O appears in the reactants and the products, so it also cancels. And then what we're left with is the species that did not cancel, which is glucose and ATP on the reactant side, and then ADP and glucose 6-phosphate on the product side. So what this means is that when this reaction is coupled together, this is the reaction we're talking about when it's coupled, that reaction is going to have an energy change of negative 4.0, meaning this is now a favorable reaction. So what we've essentially done here is that I've been able to phosphorylate glucose 6-phosphate in a way that is favorable, in a way in which now the products can be formed. It will proceed because of this negative sign. So that is what we mean by coupling. And this is why we're interested in generating ATP molecules, is because if your body needs energy, it's going to look for these ATP molecules where needed so that it can hydrolyze it, it can break that phosphate group in order to provide energy for chemical reactions that would otherwise not proceed readily, okay? Meaning reactions that would have a positive sign. So how we say this in words is that the hydrolysis of ATP provides the energy needed for the phosphorylation of glucose. Let's look now at how we can couple reactions to synthesize ATP. So now we're not hydrolyzing ATP, instead we are synthesizing it. So this means that the reaction I am interested in carrying out here is this one here, where ADP gets converted to ATP. But notice how we have a positive 7.3 kilocalorie per mole energy change. So this means I need to find that amount of energy or more in order for me to be able to make ATP, in order for me to synthesize it. So here we are coupling that with the hydrolysis of phosphoenolpyruvate, because this molecule has a phosphate group here that can, when it gets hydrolyzed, it releases a lot of energy. It releases negative 14.8 kilocalories per mole. So when I combine these two together, when I couple them, these will cancel, and I am left with phosphoenolpyruvate plus ADP being converted to ATP and the pyruvate molecule. And now notice that the energy is released. When you do negative 14.8 plus 7.3, you get negative 7.5. So what this is telling you is that when these two reactions are coupled, the overall energy change, the net energy change, is negative, meaning it is favorable. So now this reaction can proceed to go from ADP to ATP. So this is the importance of coupling reactions. I want to make a quick note here that when reactions are coupled or when it uses coenzymes, as we will see in another video, using NADH and FADH2, when we write these chemical or biochemical reactions, we will often draw it with a curved arrow, meaning the coupled species or the coenzymes will appear in the curved arrow so that we can place our emphasis on the organic molecules that are being converted. All right, let's apply what we just learned. So the phosphorylation of this molecule here called fructose 6-phosphate, again, this just means that I have a phosphate group on the 6th carbon of fructose. So the phosphorylation of fructose 6-phosphate to form fructose 1,6 bisphosphate, this just means I have two phosphate groups, one in carbon number 1, the other one in carbon number 6. So when we phosphorylate fructose 6-phosphate to form the fructose 1,6 bisphosphate and water, this is going to require 3.9 kilocalories per mole of energy. So that chemical reaction is written here. And what they have told me is that the energy change for this reaction is unfavorable, meaning it requires energy. That means it has a positive sign, 3.9 kilocalories per mole. So the first question here is, what is the energy change for the reverse reaction? That is, they're asking for the hydrolysis of fructose 1,6 bisphosphate to form what was given to us as a reactant. So here they are just testing your ability to recognize that when you take a reaction in the reverse, you are going to have the same energy change, but with an opposite sign. So if going in the forward direction, as shown here, requires, it is a plus 3.9, that means that going in the reverse direction, that will just be a negative 3.9 kilocalories per mole. So when you go in the opposite direction, you release energy, but when you go in the forward, you require it. The next question is write a coupled reaction. So we're going to write a chemical reaction that shows how the energy from ATP hydrolysis can be used to drive the given reaction. Okay, so they've given you how much energy is released when you hydrolyze ATP, but we need to write in the ATP hydrolysis reaction. So as we talked about, we said that ATP, when it is hydrolyzed, so it reacts with water, that forms a DP and inorganic phosphate, HPO4 2-. So this is the hydrolysis of ATP. This one has negative 7.3 kilocalories per mole. Now, in order to write the coupled reaction, which is what they're asking for, I need to cancel out the common reactants and products and then write my net equation. So I see that HPO4 is on the reactants and the products, H2O is on the reactant and the product. So I am left with fructose 6-phosphate. So this is my answer to part B, where I am writing the coupled reaction. So this coupled reaction is going to be fructose 6-phosphate. I'm going to write phosphate like this, plus I have ATP, the other reactants canceled, and then I'm going to have fructose 1,6 bisphosphate plus ADP, because all of the other products canceled. So what this means is that the energy change for my coupled reaction is going to be negative 7.3 plus 3.9, which is equal to 3.4 kilocalories per mole. Right. So this was my answer to part B. And then in C, they are asking what is the energy change for this coupled reaction? Well, we just calculated that, which is negative 3.4 kilocalories per mole. So the coupled reaction is the one written here, and then that energy change is what we calculated on the other side. Okay, and that is all there is to coupling reactions. Again, the main idea here is that when you couple things to ATP, you can go from an unfavorable reaction that would normally not proceed to now a favorable one where you have a negative sign on the net energy change because you were able to provide the energy you needed and more with your ATP hydrolysis reaction. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and step from talking about the microscopic world, meaning talking about molecules, and now zooming out and talking about the macroscopic world and thinking about the energy that we get from food. So up to this point, we have been talking about the units of calorie. More specifically, we were talking about kilocalories. So if you look back at the previous problem, you can see that the units here are kilocalories per mole. So how do these calories relate to the calories that we talk about in our diets? Well, they are related, they're not the same thing. So a lowercase c calorie has a certain definition. You don't need to memorize this definition. It's just here for your reference, that it does have a formal definition, which is the amount of energy that is needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Okay, so that's how we have decided to define calorie. Now, a dietary calorie with a capital C, that is going to have a different definition. It is related to calories, however. So 1,000 calories, which is 1 kilocalorie, these are the units we have been talking about up to this point, that is going to be equal to 1 capital C calorie. So how is this useful? Well, we have been able to figure out how many calories, dietary calories, so the capital C calorie, we've been able to figure out how many calories a gram of either protein, carbohydrates, or fat would potentially provide. Meaning, if you were to break down fat, for example, if you were to break down 1 gram of fat all the way down to generating ATP, it is estimated that it would provide 9 calories or 9 kilocalories. Okay, so what this chart is showing you here is that per gram of your substance, so whether it's protein, carbohydrates, or fat, there's a certain amount of calories that are contained in that amount of food. Meaning when you break it down, that is how much energy you're expected to get. So here it means that you get 4 calories for every gram of protein. You also get 4 calories for every gram of carbs, but you get 9 calories for every gram of fat. So this is why we say that fats provide a lot of energy, they provide a lot of calories, because for every gram, it provides much more calories than for every gram of carbs and protein. So let's look at how we can use this information. So here we have a 1/4 pound burger with cheese that contains 29 grams of protein, 40 grams of carbohydrates, and 26 grams of fat. Now we want to calculate how many calories, so it has a capital C, this means dietary calories, that the 1/4 pounder burger contains. Well, in order to do this, we just use those conversion factors in the previous slide. So we have 29 grams of protein. And what we just talked about is that in 1 gram of protein, I have 4 calories with a capital C. So this means that for every gram of protein that I consume, I can potentially provide my body with 4 calories of energy. So in this case, we just have to multiply 29 times 4, and that is going to give you the amount of calories that you can potentially get from breaking down this protein. So that's 116 calories. Now we can do this for all of them. I'm going to write carbohydrates as carbs for short. Again, we noticed here in the previous slide that this is the same as protein, meaning in every gram of carbs, I get 4 calories. So when you multiply 40 times 4, that's going to give you 160 calories coming from carbohydrates. Lastly, we have 26 grams of fat. Now here, for every gram of fat, you're going to get 9 calories. So when we do this multiplication, we get 234 calories. So if we add this all together, we get a total of 510 calories. So if you consume your 1/4 pound burger, that you will be consuming potentially 510 calories, where if the proteins, carbs, and fats are catabolized and turned into ATP, you would expect to get about 510 calories of energy. So notice here that the majority of your calories here are coming from fat, even though, not the majority, it's about 45%. So 45% of calories are coming from fat, even though you consumed the least amount of fat. You only consumed 26 grams as opposed to 29 or 40 of proteins and carbs. And that is because, again, this calories here, you're getting 9 calories for every gram. So that means that you can get more calories from fat by consuming less of it. I mean, even if you consume less of it. All right, let's do the last one. here we have 1 serving of peanut butter contains 16 grams, 16 grams of protein, 7 of carbs, 16 of fat. Now we want to calculate the number of calories in 2 servings of peanut butter. So that means that I am consuming twice as many protein, carbs, and fat. So I have to multiply each one of these by 2. Okay. And then the rest is the same. So now instead of consuming 16 grams of protein in 1 serving, since I'm consuming 2 servings, that makes it 32 grams of protein. I will be consuming 14 grams of carbs and 32 grams of fat. So you set these up in the same way we set them up in the previous slide, where 1 gram of protein is 4 calories. And definitely you will need to memorize these, but these are easy because proteins and carbs both are going to have 4 calories as opposed to fat, which is going to have 9 calories. All right, so when we do this math, we're going to get 128 calories from protein, 56 calories from carbs, and 288 calories from fat. And when we sum all of this together, since we are rounding to one significant figure, this is about 500 calories. And what you'll notice is that a little over 50% of your calories are going to come from fat, because peanut butter contains a lot of fat, and fat has a lot of calories in it. And that is why you're going to get so many calories from consuming fat. Okay? So in the next video, we are going to talk about the coenzymes. So if we go back to our roadmap, we just finished talking about ATP, its structure, and how it is used in order to provide energy, why it is that we are interested in generating ATP in the first place. And now in the second video, we're going to talk about these reduced coenzymes, which are going to be that NADH and FADH2, so that then we can start diving in more deeply into stage 3 and stage 4 of catabolism.